Sup guys? In this video, I'll be talking about Noshiro's new augment. Strap in because there's going to be a lot of yapping about context and stuff, since it's pretty convoluted to test literally anything in this game, especially vanguards with wide barrages, but at least the repeatable meta fights we have now help a little bit. Without the unique augment, I would consider her survivability to be good, but no longer exceptional by today's standards as it was on release. Her damage output, on the other hand, has fallen way behind that of modern SSR vanguards. She still has her torpedo and crit rate buffs, of course, but they weren't nearly enough to make up for her lack of damage. The augment gives her minor damage stat buffs, plus an extremely powerful timed barrage that nevertheless manages to annoy the crap of me by being 80% chance to activate. I mean, it's close enough to 100% that they really should just make it 100%. Or why not at least put a condition like, if she's using Algerian equipment, increase the activation chance by 20% or something. Anyway, looking at its specs, it averages around 1900 base damage on a 10-second cooldown, which when adjusted for its lower proc rate is around 1500 base damage every 10 seconds. This by itself is quite high for base damage, but it is further amplified more than other light cruisers' barrages, since it scales off her torpedo stat, which is much higher than that of the typical light cruiser's firepower stat. For example, looking at Noshiro's torpedo stat here, even without accounting for her skill buff, she's sitting at over 600 with a normalish loadout, while Bayard, for instance, has about 350 firepower, so the total damage of Noshiro's barrage will be a lot higher than what the base implies, which in itself is already quite high. Aside from the damage, we also have to consider its ballistics. It ignores shield and pierces 99 targets, but is not aimed, which suggests that it would be extremely potent in campaign, but not very reliable against a single target. In this slow motion clip, you can see just how much coverage it has, and this is just in Chapter 13. In Chapters 14 and 15, there are even more, even heavier armored enemies for it to hit. The way it fans out is very reminiscent of just normal torpedoes, so if you're against a single enemy, it really doesn't seem to be that useful. I sortied her alongside Provencian in Chapter 13.4. All of the raw footage of my testing will be linked in the description. Since Noshiro gives the entire vanguard a hefty torpedo and crit buff, I wanted to at least choose another ship who didn't rely on torpedo damage. I also already have a pretty good idea of where Provencian stands, as I tested her alongside Scylla and Shimanto separately, and she was keeping up with both of them, which is to say that her damage output in campaign is on the higher end of the light cruiser class as a whole, but nowhere close to the pinnacle, which would be Bayard. Note that this is not exactly a fair comparison, as I gave Noshiro an Oxytorp, which I think is okay because I just want to see her relative damage potential. And at this point, I'm not really trying to make any statements about how her damage compares exactly to Provencian. Her damage is going to increase substantially due to the Oxytorp, but it is an advantage which is afforded to her because she has a torpedo ship, which is something that gunboats like Provencian cannot replicate. The results here actually shocked me. Her end-screen results were consistently eclipsing those of Provencian to the point where I thought something was wrong, but I couldn't find what it was. After adjusting for anti-air damage, Noshiro was essentially doubling Provencian's damage output on average. With the potential being displayed here, I think a more fair comparison might be between her and Bayard. The issue here is that having two ships as strong as Bayard would be too much to test properly in 13.4, for the same reason I never count the runs on 2-star nodes on this map. They would finish the fights way too quickly, and one or the other might just burst all the enemies at once and steal all the damage from the other ship. I considered going to Chapter 15 instead, since Chapter 14 has the fog mechanic, which changes things a bit, but Chapter 15 also requires a full fleet, which introduces a lot of noise, and there will be even more anti-air damage that is going to pollute the end-screen results, so I didn't really want to do that either. My solution was to test them out against Algerie META instead, which, like campaign, also has multiple enemies, but it doesn't have the issue of having too little HP that they're stealing damage from each other, or any anti-air damage to worry about. Instead, there are other issues that will need to be addressed. In terms of equipment, I gave them both plus 10 stuff, mainly because I only have one Plymouth gun at plus 13, and the pierce it provides is necessary for consistency since I'm fighting Algerie META. Having two main gun mounts, Bayard would benefit more from having a plus 13 gun than Noshiro, while Noshiro would benefit more from having plus 13 torpedoes. Both of them are extremely reliant on their barrages, but Noshiro more so than Bayard. I gave each of them one rudder and one offensive auxiliary, but Noshiro definitely benefits a bit more from having that oxytorp than Bayard does from that Fumo radar. And here are the results. Bayard turned out to deal more damage on average than Noshiro, but rather than taking them at face value, since the environment of this fight is 1 of 1, I used it to make some inferences about how they would compare in campaign stages. Of course, Noshiro gives Bayard 20% increase to her torpedo stat and 12% increase to her crit stat, which directly affects the final damage number. Just from that alone, I think Noshiro's damage contribution exceeded that of Bayard's. So, while all of Bayard's barrages and her main guns are stopped by enemy shields, which are very common in campaign, Noshiro's new barrage completely ignores them, which would shift the playing field heavily in her favor. Next, Noshiro's modifiers are strongest against heavy armor, which do exist in campaign, but the Algerie META fight only has medium armor enemies, so she would have an advantage there, especially against those command ships that are not only heavy armor but also carriers, which Noshiro has a 20% damage boost against. That often goes unused. I did quickly take them out for a spin in 13.4 as well, but I wouldn't really put a whole lot of stock into these results by themselves. It was immediately obvious that Bayard was crushing Noshiro, but Bayard herself can clear these nodes faster than a full vanguard of weaker SSR ships, so there just isn't enough enemies left for Noshiro to even hit. I ended up stopping pretty early and brought them to 15.4 instead. In 15.4, I can't just sortie 3 ships that deal 0 damage in the main fleet, so I can't do the same approximation of AA damage as I do in 13.4, so I tried to gather a relatively large sample size to account for the variance in the results due to AA damage, but it's still a bit too low because of how many planes there are. Once again, I'm only dealing with 3-star carrier and battleship fleets, because I don't want anti-submarine damage to muddy the results, and there are frequent enough 3-star spawns that I don't have to add 2-star ones as distinct samples. Looking at the results, based on just the average damage, Noshiro dealt less than Bayard against battleship nodes by a small margin, but dealt more than Bayard against carrier nodes by a larger margin. Noshiro performing relatively better against carrier nodes does check out with her 20% damage buff against carriers. Also unsurprisingly, due to the nature of torpedoes as well as her 80% proc chance on the new barrage, Noshiro's results had a higher standard deviation. When accounting for the crit rate and torpedo buffs that Noshiro provided to Bayard, it's hard to say that Bayard was better even against the battleship nodes. Keep in mind that in these tests, I gave each of them 1 damage auxiliary. If you're forced to run 2 defensive auxiliary, then Bayard will perform relatively better as she's less reliant on her barrage and the firepower auxiliaries are just generally weaker than oxytorps. If you can get away with 2 damage auxiliaries though, then Noshiro will ascend even further. Between the Algerie META results and the 15.4 results, I do believe that in environments where there are a lot of enemies for Noshiro to hit with her new barrage, especially if they're not primarily light armor, she can perform at least on par with the strongest vanguards like Bayard, and be an excellent option if your other 2 vanguards happen to deal a lot of torpedo damage as well. However, a lot of endgame content calls for anti-air, in which she is still lacking, and she's not super reliable as a main tank either, so I would consider her overall role as a damage dealer that doesn't need to be babysat. One more thing I wanted to check was Noshiro's damage in a solo heavy armor boss fight in comparison to Bayard, and for this I'm going to be fighting Arizona META. As it turns out, even though Noshiro's modifiers are the strongest against heavy armor, and Bayard's are the weakest, having a barrage pattern like unaimed straight torpedoes does not correlate to good performance against a single enemy, so she's not going to be on my radar for a typical boss fight, regardless of armor type. Looking at my Vanguard tier list, which I think could use another restructuring because support Vanguards are once again dominating over damage dealers, For now, I would put her probably between Ibuki and Watarase. While her damage output in campaign might be higher than these few ships around her, they're all much better than her in any kind of solo boss fight, but I will put her just above Watarase because she provides good buffs to your other vanguards, is tankier, and Watarase's performance varies with the flagship you're using. Okay, that's it for Noshiro's Augment. Hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.